Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, and since patch 7.4 brought some balance changes, that means we are going to update our tier list of the best classes for Star Wars: The Old Republic PvP. As in previous patches, the meta is very favored to ranged classes right now, especially sorcerers and snipers. But I feel like in this patch I've been seeing at least 2 tanks and 1 or 2 healers in every warzone. At least that's my experience from playing on Darth Malgus. So we will take that into account as well. And a little bit differently from the last tier list, I'm not gonna go through each class individually, but I will be talking only about the specs that have some changes in the tier list. So without further ado, what changed? First of all, of course, Vengeance got some changes. For PvE, they were probably slightly annoying, maybe even nerfs, but for PvP, the bug fix to deep cuts was clearly a buff. I've played a bunch of Vengeance games already, and the spec definitely feels strong. It is very good into healers and tanks if the enemy decides to clump up, but it is still held back by being quite poor into a lot of the ranged and dot classes, particularly Madness and Engineering. So if the enemy is smart and they can deny your insane AoE damage, then as Vengeance, you still have some trouble surviving, which really holds the spec back. Vengeance previously was sitting at the bottom of B tier. I think the buffs were not enough to put it into A tier, but I would definitely prefer to have a Vengeance in my team over, let's say, a Fury Marauder. So I will upgrade Vengeance slightly, but it is still in B tier. Next up, there were some nerfs to Engineering Sniper, but to be honest, nerfs can barely be felt. The spec is still very, very good. And with the higher gear that was introduced in this patch, you can get even bigger crits. So overall, I feel like Engineering is in a very solid spot. If you're good with the spec, then it's definitely one of the most powerful classes in the game, so I've decided to leave it in A tier for now. The third change in the patch is that Pyro's tactical got nerfed. Pyro lost a lot of its burst potential, but it is still a very strong class for PvP. And that's because Pyro is very hard to shut down, because you cannot kill it easily. It is definitely the tankiest of the melee DPS specs. You also cannot really outplay its damage. It simply dots you and then runs around dotting all your teammates. Pyro is a great tank killer, which means it's very favored in the current meta. And with the possibility to run Terminator Droid, it counters every non-PowerTech melee class. So while Pyro has been nerfed, I think it is still the second best DPS spec in the game, and I will leave it in S tier, although slightly further behind Madness now. Next up, I am downgrading Lethality from S tier to the top of A tier. Why is that, you might ask? Lethality hasn't actually seen any changes. Well, for one, it's because I don't really see anyone playing it anymore. And while I think the spec is still strong, it does have some weaknesses. It struggles into the classes that are powerful at the moment. Madness, for example, and even Engineering. Ever since the sniper specs got their passive heal when they're in cover, it is not that easy to kill them anymore with Lethality. Lethality really lacks some reliable single target damage when you're running the AoE tactical. And while it's still very good into PowerTechs, for example, I feel like just the fact that no one is really playing it, and of course the fact that it has gotten nerfed in previous patches, probably warrants a downgrade into A tier. And then for the final change to the DPS classes, I will downgrade Hatred from B tier to C tier. Now, Hatred is very good in PvE, but in PvP it simply struggles, both in arenas and warzones, when it comes to survivability. Of course, you can run 2 cloaks and you can be quite okay at defending a pylon, for example, but in a big team fight, something like a 6v6 Zerg or something, Hatred is simply too squishy, so you do need a guard permanently to survive and a heal. But if the tank needs to keep the guard all the time on you, then of course he's not guarding your teammates, he's not guarding your healer. So Hatred is still too squishy. It either needs some more buffs to its self-healing or some more damage reduction. In my opinion, Hatred is definitely not on par with the other specs in B tier, so I'm moving it to C tier. So those are all the changes for the DPS classes, and now I want to talk about the support specs. First of which we have Medicine. I think for Warzones, Medicine is not in a great spot right now because you are very reliant on having a guard. However, in the arena tier list, I think I rated Medicine as probably the worst spec out of all. For this Warzone tier list, I think Medicine is not quite as bad because again, in the current meta there are a lot of tanks. There is a lot of AoE healing, which Medicine is good at. And if you do have that guard, then you can output some nice HPS numbers. So right now I see Medicine definitely still as the worst of the 3 healing specs, and I would put it in C tier. Bodyguard is the best healer in PvP right now, and I would argue it is a close second best behind Madness overall when it comes to specs for Warzone PvP. Bodyguard has incredibly strong heals, strong defensive cooldowns, good utility as well. It is just really a very great all-round healing spec, and that's why it sits in S tier. Immortal is similar. In my tank tier list for the last patch, I put this in A tier, but having played with a lot more Immortals recently, you will always see one in every Warzone, and there's a reason for it. The spec is really strong. It can rival a lot of the DPS specs when it comes to damage output, and while it is not as tanky as Shield Tech, it is still tanky enough. Of course, it does have a guard, it has great hard stuns, a very, very powerful spec, and so it goes into S tier. Darkness Tank is not in a great spot for Warzones. It does have some good AoE potential, but overall the damage will be lower on average compared to Immortal, and probably also lower than Shield Tech. Darkness is good because it's the only tank that has stealth, but that's really the only thing it has going for it. It is not the most tanky spec when you run DPS gear. If you run full defense gear, of course, you can simply forget to die, particularly with 2 cloaks, and you can defend a node forever. So if you're enjoying that, then Darkness might be the spec for you, but if you enjoy actually fighting and killing people, then Darkness is only C tier. Corruption Sorcerer is a very solid spec, although I don't think it's at the same power level as Bodyguard. It has very good healing for single target and for AoE, but I feel it's a bit weaker than Bodyguard when it comes to output. On the side of defensive cooldowns, the two are similar. Bodyguard can survive longer on its own. Corruption is better at kiting. If both have a guard, then to be honest, it's quite similar. However, I would give Bodyguard slightly the edge, and I think Corruption is a very solid spec, but it's not overpowered or anything, so I would put it in A tier. Next up, we have Shield Tech, also known as the PT tank. And Shield Tech was also using the tactical of Pyro, which got nerfed. So you're going to be definitely doing a little bit less damage when you play Shield Tech this patch. However, overall, this is definitely one of the strongest specs in the game, because the damage is still good, your AoE potential is quite high, and even your main filler applies a healing debuff and is spammable. So if you're in a game with a lot of melees, you can almost constantly keep the healing debuff up. Shield Tech has the best survivability out of all the 3 tank specs, and of course Shield Tech has also very great control. It does have access to the Terminator droid, which slows everyone and reduces accuracy as long as the enemy are in that zone. And with the 2 pulls and Carbonize hard stun, it is also very good at controlling ranged classes. Overall, I would put Shield Tech at the number 3 spot currently, so I rank it after Madness and Bodyguard, as for sure one of the best specs in PvP right now. That's it for today, guys. If you have any questions about this tier list, let me know in the comments below, or join my Discord where there are lots of helpful people that can answer them. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.